All right. I think that we can go ahead and get started. I would like to kick off this crucial conversation by saying hello. So, hi, and thank you both to our panelists and to our participants for joining us for this very first crucial conversation. This is a panel series to kick off SWOG's virtual group meeting next week. My name is Jo Horn. I'm president and CEO of the Hope Foundation. Hopefully, you're aware of what the Hope Foundation is, but should you not be familiar, since 1993, we've supported SWOG with innovative programming and educational support. Particularly at this time, we are really committed to building connections with and between members and to offering a more engaged, multidimensional, cooperative group experience where things can seem fairly decentralized and virtually flat at that point. We really hope to build out conversations and community that we all know are important to create. So this series was launched as really with the context of finding the intersectionality between the world's current events, what's happening in all of our lives, politically, socially, economically, and what's happening in our lives as clinical researchers, and understanding that we need to validate and talk about and communicate what happens in that space. So the initial conversation is obviously focused around COVID. But before I turn it over to Dr. Don Hirschman, who will moderate the event, I wanted to take care just of a few housekeeping things. The first is that this is a conversation, which means we've got a two-way, we expect you to engage. We would love to hear what you have to say. To do this, you have a couple of options. You can raise your hand. In the participant list, you will see a small hand with the black outline. You can tap that. We will call you. Or you can use the Q&A or the chat box. We're going to vet that on the back side. And we would love for you to just jump in and have thoughts and reactions and responses so that this really doesn't seem like another pushing of information out to you, but is rather something that's more engaged and involved. And finally, one more tip, and this is totally personal preference. I like to go up to the upper right-hand corner where you see those four dots and put the screen in gallery view, which will allow you to see all the panelists at one time, as opposed to having the individual pop in and out while they're speaking. So that said, without further ado, our panelists, and you'll see they'll come up on the screen here in a moment, will quickly introduce themselves, but they've been curated very intentionally. They are active SWOG members, leaders, Hope grantees, who are at various stages in their careers. They're from all corners of the country, from multiple disease areas and modalities of care. We really look forward to the multiple perspectives across career trajectories and across geographics to see what's been presented to us as clinicians and researchers in this COVID state, what kinds of solutions we might come up with, and what kind of conversation and communication we can actually share. So without further ado, I'll pass this over to SWOG Vice Chair, Dr. Don Hirschman, for the story about how this conversation came to be and where it may go in the next hour here. Then we'll jump into quick intros by the panelists themselves, and we can get straight into questioning. So without further ado, Don.
Yeah, so first of all, welcome. Thank you all for participating in this. It's an experiment for us, but I think it's something that's really desperately needed in these strange times where we're not really meeting with each other and having these conversations in hallways, but by bringing people together so that we can share our experiences. And, you know, it's an unprecedented time for us as healthcare workers and researchers and, you know, people with families, where we've had, you know, so many issues come up that have affected us in terms of our safety, going to work, issues related to how we're going to work and childcare, finances in a very strange way, thinking about our practices, how we're going to stay solvent, our academic environment with financial issues, funding agencies and foundations taking a financial hit, and, you know, how we're going to maintain our professional lives throughout all of this. And I think from a SWOG perspective and a hope perspective, we wanted to hear about people's experiences and thoughts and concerns, and also use that as an opportunity to think, are there solutions? Are there shared experiences that we can all learn from? And maybe hearing about everybody's experiences will make us feel a little bit less alone. So part of this is to recreate some of the things that we've lost by not being able to be in person. So with that, and as Joe had said, you know, this is the first of several panel series that we're planning as a way to really help us feel connected and engaged to each other. I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves and just share a few lines about yourself in terms of where you're from and what your connection to SWOG is. And then I think throughout this, I'm going to refer to everybody by their first name. I don't want to offend anybody, but I just think it'll make it a little bit more personal to do that. So just stating that up front. So I don't know if we can go through and have everybody introduce themselves.
So I'm Mark. I am the Director of Gastrointestinal Oncology at Intermountain Healthcare in Utah. As we might discuss, my practice extends throughout this state into adjacent states. And being able to connect with patients remotely has been a key part of how I've dealt with the pandemic. And then in SWOG, I'm very lucky. I'm co-chair of the Adolescent and Adult Committee and also a member of Digital Engagement, the latter of which has also been really important during this time.
Wonderful. How about you, Dr. Mon?
Good morning. I'm Ben Mon. I'm one of the GU medical oncologists right next door to Mark at the University of Utah Huntsman Cancer Center, literally right next door. Anyway, so I'm involved in a number of the committees at SWOG, including the GU committee, and also I have the opportunity to participate in the committee with Mark as a member. With our shared interest of rare cancers, including germ cell or testicular cancers that affect young men. So I have to say thank you for putting this together, Joe. This is so fabulous. I'm perhaps not the biggest fan. I think there's some people that might compete with me for that, but I'm a huge fan of Hope and SWOG and what you've been able to accomplish. So thanks for putting this together.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Ishwarya.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm Ishwarya Sabaya. I'm apparently a virtual homeschooling pro at the moment for a 9-year-old, a 6.5-year-old, and a 4-year-old. And in my free time, I also am a palliative care physician and medical oncologist at MD Anderson. And within SWOG, I'm involved in the nascent palliative care and end-of-life care committee. My work really centers around optimizing symptom management, new algorithms for predicting toxicities, et cetera, for patients who are standard of care as well as on clinical trials.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And Banu.
It's nice to see two Turks on this committee. Hi, Zynep. Never met you. I am medical director of a frontier cancer center adjacent to Salt Lake City, 250 miles away in Rock Springs, Wyoming, affectionately known as the armpit of Wyoming. I'm on a few of the SWOG committees. I'm a HOPE grant recipient and enjoying telemedicine with my patients who are 200 to 300 miles away. Some of them actually can only contact me by phone because internet access is so poor in the state of Wyoming.
Wow.
So that's my brief intro. I look forward to this session. I believe I know Ben. We have some patients in common. Nice to meet you, Mark. You're a neighbor.
All right. I'm going to try one more
Nice to see
time.
you as well, Banu.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes. Welcome.
microphone was used as a call from my phone. My name is Zynep. I'm a junior medical oncologist at Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa, Florida. I'm in the Department of Cutaneous Oncology, seeing patients with advanced skin cancers, and I'm part of the SWOG Melanoma Committee.
Excellent. And I also have word here that Jason Zell will be joining us, but he's stuck in some virtual limbo. Surprise. So when he does pull in, don't be surprised. We'll intro him then, although he need not really an introduction from anyone. So, Dawn, why don't I just hand it back to you and we can go ahead and get started.
Sure. So I think, you know, obviously we want to try our best to have this be a conversation. There are certain themes that we wanted to sort of try to hit in terms of, you know, how we're balancing work-life balance and issues that have come up, issues related to changes in work demands, concerns about practices and how they're going to stay afloat financially, and concerns about how all of these changes are going to affect our careers, both, you know, really specifically, both in terms of, you know, junior faculty and concerns about publications and grants and promotions and all of those things that one may be concerned about. So maybe to start, we'll talk about issues related to work-life balance. You know, Ben, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about ways you and your colleagues may have been affected by what's going on and how you've approached that.
Yeah, I have to say I really appreciate Eswari's introduction there, because I can completely empathize with you. You know, now that, you know, my kids are, I know schools are all different, but where my girls go to school, it's all virtual, right? So it's no in-person. And so it feels very much like homeschooling, which honestly I tried to avoid for a long time because it sounded so hard. It's a challenge, because I feel like, you know, over this last sort of few months, when they finished their end of their last school year and now the beginning of this school year, it certainly takes, seems like it's harder for them to, you know, acquire the knowledge and information compared to when they were in person and right there directly, physically with their teachers and tutors and everything. And so it's required a lot more, I don't know, time and effort and commitment on my part to help them figure out how to, like, physically do this, you know, with Zoom and WebEx and everything, and learn the material. And I will say it's really strained my knowledge to go back and learn, you know, relearn chemistry and math and some of these things that I've forgotten. But that certainly has been a challenge, I think, for me, in terms of this work-life balance, because, you know, leading up to this pandemic, I sort of had a sort of system of, you know, what I was doing to try and, you know, be involved in my kids' life, my wife, and you know, still try and do all these projects and, you know, research projects and clinical practice work. And it's required some rethinking and restructuring, and it's been a challenge. You know, I don't know. I feel like I'm still struggling with it, and I guess that's all I can say. It's a challenge, but we'll see as the school year evolves, I suppose.
I imagine that there are some other folks who have some thoughts about work-life balance. Oh, but pause, because Jason Zell is now here in the virtual presence.
Hi there.
Not to disrupt the flow of conversation, Jason, he's a HOPE board member, SWOG leader, excellent person overall at UC Irvine. We're talking about work-life balance, and Ben just chimed in, and we are opening the floor to anybody else, and then we'll be quiet.
Sure, thank you. I was hoping to learn from this group. Once you figure out work-life balance, I'd love to hear what the answer is. Happy to share my insights.
So,
Ishwarya, do you want to talk about your experiences?
Without a doubt. And so the disruption to COVID in our area in Texas really started around March, right? That's when the changes began, with whether it's the practices themselves changing how they approach patient care, and certainly our life outside of work, whether it's school, activities, whatnot. And so One of the first things I discovered was that while I may have a wall of education, I am not a elementary school educator. I do not have the skill set to do that. And it was truly shocking to come to that realization. It really became clear that I needed to engage my community of support to try to do this. And frankly, in the context of an infectious pandemic where individual interactions would pose a risk, and I come from a family where my parents are very involved in our lives, and so they have chronic medical issues, and the sheer amount of uncertainty surrounding a brand new illness means that I wasn't ready to take a risk that even maybe the person next to me was willing to do, whether it's sending the kids back to school or whatever it may be. And so I did something that I don't usually do, which is really talk about all the issues I'm having at home with my colleagues at work. And at least my educational upbringing in medicine was that home life was almost like a church and state type separation. You don't bring that to the workplace, even in conversation, beyond just passing conversation. And so it became clear to me, like, look, I need to hear what other people are going through because, frankly, my experience, while it is my own, is not unique. And so just that alone has been very therapeutic to talk about it with others. I don't have any solutions. I frankly, realigning expectations was really what I did for myself and my family because it was clear last year that the educational experience won't be the same for my family. And this year also, I think it's better than what it was last year, but it won't be the same. So what I'm doing is actually taking palliative care principles that I use with my patients on a regular basis and bringing it home. So realigning expectations was the number one thing.
I mean, I can tell you from my kids are older, but one of the things, because I also lead a program and, so many of our doctors and nurses didn't have childcare or their structure for their childcare was sort of thrown up, sort of blew up and became unpredictable, and trying to come up with, from, taking the hat of like, how am I going to make sure that we, do all the things for our patients, but how do we be supportive for our staff, our administrative assistants, our nurses, doctors, everybody had small kids. And, we sort of have been trying to find the people like me that can have a little bit more flexibility with coverage and trying to reassign tasks, like what tasks are easier for you to do at home, what tasks do I need to be present for, and how can I be a person that serves as your backup so that even if you don't need me, just knowing that you're not going to leave like the whole practice in the lurch kind of thing. And what kind of systems can we come up to help build our team so that nobody feels stranded?
Yeah, I think this conversation is interesting because in a way I feel like we have, at least we have talked about issues with childcare and work-life balance, but what I'm hearing you and what I'd love to hear more about are potential solutions. And Dreshwar, you mentioned that false dichotomy is so of medicine and home life, and how we just need to have this conversation in a public way to start to break that down and actually real talk about what this experience is. And Don, I'm hearing you talk about a new level of delegation. Obviously from our stead at Hope and SWOG, we're interested in institutionally, how can we support our membership and our investigators? And, obviously we're not going to open a child care center and we're not going to do X, Y, and Z, which would be obvious. But I would love this think tank and this broader conversation to say, like, how can, as a culture within the organization, we support you in that? And what else has worked that you've seen in your communities? And Banu, I don't know if things are different in the community setting or you've noticed different challenges, but how can we continue more solution-based conversation around it?
So in a rural community, we don't actually have backup staff. If someone is out because they're on quarantine, And as I was thinking about solutions that HOPE or SWOG could offer, I wonder, so we have 3 part-time nurses, 1 medical oncologist, 1 nurse practitioner, 1 radiation oncologist. So if any of us are out on quarantine, brings the cancer center to a standstill. And we live in a community where we have COVID deniers, so it's very difficult to, very few people are masking. I went to Salt Lake City for the weekend and was pleasantly surprised to see how people are following masking guidelines, but they're not following them in Rock Springs, Wyoming, or in Casper, Wyoming. So the risk of transmission is higher despite the natural social distancing provided by sparse population. When I was trying to think of a solution, I wondered if there might be backup staff who were willing to travel. I'm thinking of nurses mostly, chemo-certified, oncology-certified nurses who might be willing to travel to fill a gap for a week or 2 while someone is in quarantine, because we don't have community members who are oncology nurse certified and just sitting around ready to jump in. We are working with the only trained staff we have. So that was the only solution I could come up with. I don't know if that's feasible. I don't have children at home, but all my outlets for stress relief are shut down. I'm not going to go to the gym when no one's masking and there isn't hand sanitizer. I can't go shopping because no one is masking. There's no hand sanitizer. At least during the summer I was able to hike, but in the extreme winter of Wyoming, if I don't have the gym and I can't hike outside, I'm going to be a raving lunatic, I'm afraid.
Mark, did you?
Yeah, thank you, Dawn. I was going to say, I think one of the enduring legacies of this, and you can accuse me of being a silver lining, optimist, is I think we're learning what absolutely has to be done in person, and then what we can accomplish virtually. And again, I know it's not going to be nearly as satisfying in certain tangible and intangible ways, but whether it's Aishwarya's example with education, and I'm part of a dual physician couple, and my wife and I have taken that on too, or clinical practice. And I'm really curious because I think Banu and Ben and I serve basically a rural frontier population, which might be a little different than some of our colleagues here. I think we really have to lean into telehealth and really, if we don't have to see the patient in person, almost owe it to them not to bring them to a node of high transmission. And then even in our academic and research lives, I think this is going to affect trial design moving forward. I think probably baked into feasibility from now on when we're evaluating concepts, maybe even very early stages of gestation, is again, what parts will it be absolutely mandatory for the patient to come to one of our centers versus what can we maybe outsource and delegate either to their home practice or through some sort of mobile testing. So those are all the aspects I've been thinking about. I think it's kind of the common thread in my personal and professional life is what do I have to do in person and what can I do on my computer? And again, to echo Ben's earlier sentiment, thank you so much for putting this together, because one of the things about this pandemic is that it's so isolating. And I don't think I've ever relied more on my virtual communities, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or other social media platforms. And so again, I'm really grateful for the chance to see your faces and to talk.
Great. I think it's sort of, balancing, all of our limitations in terms of what we can't get done and, doing what we need to do the bare minimum at work to make sure that patient issues don't fall through the cracks. I see that the thing that ends up falling to the bottom is the things that, like our research careers, our ability to write papers, our real ability to participate in new things, or, the flexibility of, even being able to mentor or be mentored. And, Jason, I wanted to get a sense from you, how do you think that this is, affecting people's, career trajectories and along those lines?
Thanks. That's something I think about a lot, both as fellowship director and also just being an investigator with young faculty at our own institution. It's interesting, I mentor, just to give one example of what a dramatic effect COVID has had on researchers. I'm mentoring a master's degree student in the Institute for Clinical Translational Sciences who was in the lab. I was kind of a co-mentor, basically. She was doing some very fancy pre-CAR T colon cancer type of experiments. And all of a sudden, she was scheduled to graduate in August, and then in March, her research was considered non-essential, as was all basic research at the institution. And so she had to find a new thesis. She's not going to graduate in time. She realizes her experiments are not done, so what are we going to do? And it really created a pretty large amount of panic in her life. And so after a few meetings, we actually developed a plan for a systematic review, which wouldn't require the same level of IRB oversight. And she ended up putting together a nice thesis in time, graduated just a couple of weeks ago. But I mean, she really had to take a left turn in her thesis. And as she's writing her thesis, every paragraph started with, because of the pandemic, I wasn't able to do this, so I did that. And I told her, just forget about it. Everybody's going to look at this thesis someday and realize when it was published, and that you've got two aims. One is incomplete, and there were extenuating circumstances for why that was. So that's just like a very small example of how it's affected so many researchers. Now, in terms of time and ability to write, that's a bigger issue. I've been fortunate where, thankfully, enough of my personal projects were at a point of data completion where I was able to write quite a bit during this period. And I wasn't able to engage in new research projects or even actively participate in a lot of research. That gave me time to write some things I probably should have been writing before COVID. So there's kind of pros and cons for me, but I think initiating new research was a big issue in our tenure track. There's like a big asterisk now. People can ask for more time for the review periods because it is affecting people's careers, especially if your research was shut down for 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point and something we can learn from each other, especially with regard to promotions, because I'm not sure every institution has really thought that through. And, I know that Columbia, where I'm at, for the first time ever, is extending our promotion, people that are up for promotion are on a very tight clock. And, they're giving everybody, at least at this point, they're saying everybody gets an extra year that, is on that kind of time clock. But I don't know if every institution has been so thoughtful about, whatever, even thought through the bylaw changes and all these kinds of things that happen with those kinds of things. But it's, it's sort of useful to talk about because maybe that's something that people can advocate for. Say, oh, I heard, at institution X, they're allowing more time on their promotion clock or, whatever the thing may be to sort of, put ideas in people's heads, so to speak. Zynep, what has your experience been like?
I'm more of a clinical investigator, although I do have some small projects that involve, some tissue-based analyses. So, one of the big challenges on that end was, of course, we have what we call the tissue core, where a lot of the tumor specimens, blood specimens from, patients are banked and stored. So in terms of projects that involve access to those specimens, for many, many months, a lot of the staff, had to work from home, and they essentially said, this is not considered essential. If you have any tissue or blood-based studies, clinical trials, were in a slightly separate category. But essentially, so for example, I had a small grant that, I had to get a certain number of tissue specimens analyzed, before July 1st, which is when the time period of the grant would end. So there was sort of the scramble, and I said, I literally cannot access these specimens. There's no way to get this done. So, we sort of found this workaround where they said, okay, well, why don't you use the money, which is going to expire by July 1st, to buy the reagents to be able to do the experiments in the future once you can get access to those specimens. And at least, there was some permission of, okay, the grant period would end and the funding would end, but at least, I'd be allotted some extra time to be able to complete the research once I could access those specimens. And I know from my colleagues who are more physician scientists, who have much more lab effort, or my PhD colleagues, it's been significantly very challenging, with labs that have to shut down, and so at Moffitt with staff rotating, only one person could be in the lab at a time. So I know, for our scientists and postdocs and grad students have really been impacted. For clinical trials, we also probably is very similar to other institutions. Went through this sort of what are more critical clinical trials as opposed to, ones that we may need to temporarily hold. So generally it was sort of adjuvant studies where there was placebo control arms, things like that. We said, maybe quite not as critical as opposed to studies, for example, for me, metastatic melanoma or treatment refractory melanoma, where we thought it was really important to keep those clinical trials open, to make them available to our patients. So I am happy that at least from the clinical trial perspective, most of our studies, including, from investigator-generated studies and some of our, SWOG studies we have open as well, we were able to continue, with enrollment into those. And again, having coordinators work from home, staff work from home, but it sort of try to, I think we made that work so far. So I am happy that from the clinical trials perspective, at least, we were able to continue to open studies and to enroll patients to them.
I mean, from a funding agency, Joe, I think this is something we're going to hear over and over again. And we have the SWOG Hope Foundation, which is fantastic. But I know personally quite a few foundations that fund some of my research have said instantly, we're cutting everybody's budgets. Lots of restrictions, whole grant mechanisms are gone, and people that really depend on that for their their livelihood, essentially, because they have to come up with their salary support, plus issues with timing. I mean, how do you view that as somebody that tries to raise money and also, manage people's grants?
Well, I think there's been a huge grace period from us because we do thankfully have these conversations with investigators, and the foundation itself, the Hope Foundation, is in the position of knowing, and in a personal way largely, the folks that we fund because of SWOG group meetings and because of things like that. So I think, I personally call all of our grantees and have a conversation about it, and then we can come up with the best solution, right? But that's because we, A, prioritize that, the relationship side of it, but B, have a lot of flexibility thanks to board members like Jason here, who are willing to offer some, extension in the budgets and get what's really happening on the ground. That said, it was a huge learning curve for us too. I mean, some of these things, we got a call from a grantee who had to euthanize all of their animals, all the rats, that for a TM study that we were funding with PDXs. And I was like, wow, this is early on. And I was like, I have no idea the implications and the ripple effect of this pandemic. Every day it was like a whole new conundrum to try to figure out. And I think raising money is just going to be hard. The other thing that we talked about as a board and on my finance committee, I mean, it's no joke. The endowments tanked, right? Our investments returns tanked, and they're coming back up. The money available is less. It's just less. And I worry about 2 to 3 years from now when those market cycles are catching up and there's just less for foundations to spend. But we made a conscious and intentional decision, because we do have an operating reserve and an endowment at Hope, to double down and fund research and to fill this gap, because that's what it's for. But that's more of a philosophical, and it's not a fear-based model that we take at Hope. We're not scared to spend money because it's our job to spend money. And if that means we need to spend more than we expected to spend, it's hopeful that, board members won't look at me like I totally blew our budget, but that we made a mission-based decision to maybe spend less next year or the year after in the hopes of keeping things sustained and keeping innovation going. Because let's not forget, at the end of the day, we're not interested in just treading water either, right? And how can we manipulate the experience, which has been really terrible? And I mean, I'm speaking as a person of privilege, and it's been a pain, It's been hard. And it's been hard to navigate, but also there's certainly solutions, and there's super smart people involved. And I think the truth is going to come out in conversations like these for how we can make better decisions going forward. And, we just finished, and I just sent out, or I'm sending out to the board in an hour, a budget for 2021, which is just as robust as it was in the beginning of 2020 when we didn't know any of this was happening. And we funded Zynep and another Coltman Fellow. We only had planned to fund one Coltman Fellow this year. Those were awarded, the end of March. And you know what? We funded two because they were both super great. And we thought we not only needed to send a message, and I should just let Jason talk about this, but actually, Jason, why don't I let you talk about that decision? Because I think from a funding perspective, it's important.
Yeah, sure. So it's one of the great things about the Hope Foundation committees. I've served as chair of that committee for some time, the Coltman Fellowship, and that's because I think I was the youngest one in the group at the time I was nominated. So basically, that's just the way it happened. So anyway, it's a great group of supportive mentors around me that kind of granted the first grant to myself and one other person back in 2008. But long story short is I love the group immediately, and what I realized is it's very personal. We look at these applicants as a part of SWOG already. We're really invested in them. I mean, Dawn has been involved since the beginning, so she can tell you that too. And there is not necessarily a score or a pay line that we're trying to hit, but it's the Hope Foundation, the board, listens to the recommendations of the committee. And when the committee says that we have, really outstanding applicants that we want to invest in and believe will represent SWOG through the duration of their career, then the board's very receptive to that. And when we say, hey, we need to recompete, this time is not happening, let's put together another RFA for 6 months later, we've done that too. So I just think it's a very flexible group. There's nothing cookie cutter about it. We're interested in the whole individual, not just what's on the paper, but really about the person. I think that's what Hope is actually investing in.
And do you want to talk about this without making things too personal, but about the experience of being like, you know what, I think we're going to need to recommend two? Because there was some back and forth on the committee this year, and it was during the pandemic, and the stock market was at the bottom, and it was not a time where anyone in their right minds would be like, you know what, let's just spend another $150,000. So it was a really informative conversation for me, and I think as leader of that conversation, just like a minute of what that was like.
Yeah, so I mean, the great thing is that we have advocates. So they kind of emerge from the discussions. We have advocates for certain grants, and in this particular time, we had two of them. One of which is on our panel, who we're very proud of, Zynep, who was at my institution as a resident a long time ago. And so really, you have this compelling back and forth between the funds available, the quality of the research, and the investigator behind it. And, all I can say is I really do appreciate, Joe, your flexibility, but also that of the board to recognize. The board's been very good about understanding the will of the committee, and we had strong opinions for both investigators, and so it really was in the best interest of SWOG, I think, to fund both, and I'm so happy it came down to that. Often it's a runaway. It's very clear. Everyone knows before we even get in the meeting that we've got a runaway, but I think we're funding two outstanding investigators this time, and it's because of the flexibility and the back and forth between the board and the Coltman Fellowship Committee.
And I also think it's a message, right? And the message is like, we are still here to invest in you, investigators. We are, in fact, we want to double down on that investment because we know your plates are full and we know your universities are having hiring freezes or that your tenure is going to be screwed up. And we're still here, and SWOG is still here. And obviously, you know what? Your patients are still there. And for me, that was because I've been in this job for 15 years, right? And so when I get these moments of like, yes, that's how I felt about funding these 2 Coltmans, because everything else was down, right? And it just felt like, we got to put this in for the win. So, Dawn, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of, like to that same level, I think, our mission through SWOG is to put patients on trials, obviously to design the best studies that have the highest impact for patients. But a lot of us at institutions, are in the situation as was described before, where there were holds, things that get lifted, not lifted at various different times. But, you have all of these things stacked up on your plate. What's the first thing that's going to, be put on the back burner? The thing that maybe takes a lot of your time, you're not getting a huge amount of academic credit for, maybe even costs your institution money, like how do we balance in the community, in our centers, in, our integrated healthcare networks, how do we integrate this mission of putting patients on clinical trials when we're facing so many hurdles, both in terms of not having staffing and not having financial resources? I don't know if any of your institutions have reorganized or have thought about that differently.
Banu, I would be interested in terms of on the community sites in particular, how prioritizing research have you been able to maintain that or not maintain that, and what the workarounds have been? And then also maybe from you, Zynep, coming from a hotspot, and I know some, Dawn, you can speak to this at Columbia as well, but that put a different level of strain on your institution. So maybe we can see what you have to say.
Yeah.
So, Joe, were you asking for me to say something about this? Yeah. So we became a SWOG trial site about a year ago, the only one in Wyoming. And we have been unable to open a single trial because we were supposed to have on-site training of staff for data collection, CRAs, et cetera. And that couldn't happen during the COVID pandemic. The University of Utah was going to do the training, but they didn't want their staff traveling here in the middle of the pandemic. So we have been unable to open a trial and accrue a single patient in the year since we became a SWOG trial site. That's how it up.
One would hope that's where the asterisk that I think Jason was talking about in terms of publications, et cetera, comes in when it comes to your SWOG membership and accrual stats and report of studies. I mean, the way that we look at how this pandemic rolls out is significant, right? But then it ends up having these direct implications for you. And Zynep, can you talk a bit, or Dawn, about hotspot reactions and institutional, how that happened?
Sure. So at Moffitt, initially as we're going through March, April, May, which is some Moffitt's in Tampa, Florida, we took some precautions and kind of went through the clinical trials portfolio that we have, and again, kind of decided to put on accrual hold some of the studies, and sort of across the board, not just specific for trials, but really incorporating a lot of telemedicine visits to a much, much higher degree than we ever had previously. But I think in Florida, it was really starting in end of June, July, August, that was really an incredible surge. And I think really started to have patients, including those on clinical trials, we become very concerned about coming in for, required visits or procedures. So I know for, the NCI had put out a memorandum, which included, the SWOG studies as well, that gave some flexibility. For example, if you had a missed biopsy, it could be a minor deviation, as opposed to a major deviation. So, I think that was really appreciated with continuing to enroll into some of these clinical trials, especially at a period really over the summer when there was a lot of, hesitance and, with our patients, they really, metastatic melanoma tends to be older, our average age is probably, in their mid-70s. So I do think, from the NCI, having that guidance of, with some flexibility into the studies was much appreciated. And I do think kind of going forward, in terms of trying to expand access to clinical trials, so not just, cooperative group studies, but kind of across the board, I do think, trying to incorporate more of these, telemedicine visits, having some more flexibility, or we're doing, electronic consenting as opposed to right now we have to do, wet ink signatures to consent patients. I do think in the future, sort of something we could take away from this, it really may actually increase in the future clinical trial enrollment and make these studies available to more patients than they are currently available to.
Yeah, I mean, at our institution, during the, we had that initial wave, and now we're sort of coming out of it. And so, we all had to go through all of, like, the IRB initially shut down everything. So it's like a huge amount of time, energy, and effort of the entire staff to deal with all of the, energy and regulatory issues about that. And then dealing with the patients that are on study, and then now, like, dividing up into, like, quartiles, essentially, in terms of opening them up in phases. But, it's still, super challenging trying to convince patients to go on to clinical trials in this environment. And that a lot of these things that have been put into place will stick because they make sense. They're important. Lots of things we did that inconvenienced people because nobody had the insights or courage or whatever you want to call it to do things a different way. Now that we're forced to do it, we see it, it works quite well. So we will be able to make things simpler and better going forward. We already do remote consent and get bloods and send medications. But the time and energy it takes to get somebody to agree to go on a study, it's really challenging if you're not in person. And I don't know, maybe, there's a lot we can do visually and virtually, but, my experience is that people are overwhelmed. So, unless they're in I don't have any other option mode, which is a different kind of clinical trial, I'm finding personally it's hard to get people to commit to doing it. And I don't know what any of your experiences have been like.
So Don, I have to say, I definitely appreciate, everyone's input about the research seems to be the piece that is most frequently first lost, in dealing with these time issues. And that's sort of been my experience as well. And so, even though, like, going back to some of the earlier conversations, even though you don't have kids, I certainly appreciate, your perspective that making some changes in how you delegate things can be, certainly good advice on, like how I can address some of my solutions, right? So I can certainly, just thinking about my situation, I can better work to have some of, like, the nurse practitioners I work with do some of the phone calls so I can reallocate some of my time to sort of maintain or support some of these research efforts. Institutionally, I think we have sort of learned, again, at least at our institution, we have sort of relearned how to do some of these processes, doing remote consenting, some of those other things, which I think is a big lesson learned for us, at least with our community. where we do have, I mean, there's a number of patients we enroll, directly from this more urban Salt Lake City area, but then there's a lot of patients that we have and serve that come from a lot of these rural areas in Montana and Wyoming and Idaho and Nevada. And being able to do things where they don't have to travel, 200 miles every 2 weeks, certainly makes participation in the, clinical trial a lot more feasible and convenient and doable for them. And so those are definitely some lessons learned that I've experienced in how I start designing, future, IATs, et cetera, to incorporate some of these telemedicine aspects to support patients to be able to enroll in these trials.
Yeah, Don, I'd like to add to that too. Just from the CRA side, there's been some, challenges because our CRAs were not in the room. Actually, they're really still not in the room at my institution. But there's been some benefits too. And I'm hoping you'll see that, the SWOG will see that coming down the road. I've been saying for 3 years, why can't we use DocuSign? The CRA will spend, literally you have to hire one CRA just to get all the delegation of authority lists signed by 15 different, investigators at the institution, some of whom are operating. It's basically impossible. It's an impossible challenge. And I'm sure we've had so many minor deviations based on the signature missing here or there. Now, I get an email that says all of a sudden I can DocuSign. I sign it within 3 seconds because it's done and over with, out of mind. And I actually think the completion rates for a lot of these tasks, which they're critically important, but they were very tedious. I think that's actually improved because of our response to the pandemic. So there's been some pros and cons with the research, organization through clinical trials.
Yeah, this is Mark. I was going to, again, echo what Jason and Ben said. On the one hand, we're on the cutting edge of science. On the other hand, healthcare may be the only industry keeping the fax machine afloat, right? So we've got this inherent, technological dichotomy in our working lives. And one thing I should have admitted at the beginning is I co-chair the IRB at my institution. So some of my colleagues have told me that as a researcher, I've gone over to the dark side, and that may be true. But to Ben's point, I think, again, looking on the bright side, I think we've gotten a lot more agile and a lot more flexible. So again, since March, we've actually approved 40 studies here specific to COVID. And there has been some grousing that has taken away resources from existing protocols, which is true. We have finite amount of manpower and money, so that is going to happen. But it's also shown us that we can get research up and going faster than before. So from an institution and a regulatory committee that was viewed as really a hindrance and one that came with a lot of inertia, we've proven you can actually go quickly. It doesn't entirely mean you get rid of all the safeguards, but you can go a lot faster than before. And again, it actually incorporates a lot of what Jason and Ben have mentioned, is just being a little bit more technologically agile, not requiring so many physical signatures or not requiring so many things in series and doing more things in parallel. So I think that is one of the lessons going forward.
I appreciate that. And Mark, I'm also a closet IRB member at the University of Michigan. So I will say we have seen more and more studies. And on the other side of the fence, the conversation, I'm actually really impressed. And I'm a, righteous IRB advocate, and I do a lot of talking, and I find that there's a lot of positive response to making changes. So I'm hopeful that, it's unfortunate to say, but maybe that was the push, right? Maybe that was the push people needed, because otherwise it's so easy to rest on laurels. Because you're busy with the rest of life, and why change something that doesn't seem broke? That said, I'm cognizant of the time, so I want to, Don, pass this back to you before I wrap up. Are there any last-minute thoughts you'd like to drive home or takeaways you'd like to pull out?
I think, one of the things that, I'd like everybody either, on the call to think about is really going forward what we can do to maintain all of the lessons learned that will make our lives better. Because, whether it's from a research experience, whether it's from not having to travel so much, for example, or, that you know, my kids who are older spend a lot more time at home than they did before. And, you know, what are the things that might make us better people, better researchers, you know, more efficient, better at our patients, and what we can do to really advocate for making those things more of a part of our lives going forward. So sometimes I appreciate everybody's honesty, and sometimes talking through, it gives us an idea of what we can do in SWOG to help, how we can set our priorities to make sure that the initiatives we put forward are meaningful to the membership.
And I think to build on that, I would like to maintain this communication and make myself, I know that there are leadership represented on this call, and perhaps you can take this out into other spaces of your SWOG connections when we look at group meeting next week. But how can we continue to figure out what the solutions are, right? Because I'm in the grateful position of then being able to propose those to a board to actually make some changes. And I want to make sure that those changes would be well informed and, you know, driven by you all and members of SWOG, as opposed to what we think is needed for folks. And that this is how we gather our data, right? This is our how we figure out what the answers are. So I'd like to close now. I would like to thank all the participants who logged in. I would like to obviously thank our panelists. I think this is an ongoing conversation, and you'll see more in this panel series so that we can continue to talk about what's relevant to life and build space where it's important to engage and pivot. And that's also going to be the word of 2020, I think. And just make space for change, because it's obviously what we all know that we need in this state of the world right now. And I think one of the things to think about as we look forward to the virtual group meeting next week is, you know, maybe there are some things in that format that really are going to work better. You know, then we can get to more meetings. We can maybe have offline conversations with more individuals via email or what have you. But, you know, this is the world for the unforeseeable future, and we're working with it. So how do we continue to work with it, not only to baseline, but to succeed and be successful and to do things better? So I appreciate all of the roles that you played in making that happen today. So thanks. And that's it. This will be available online on the microsite for the SWOG group meeting, and we will see you all soon. And thanks again to those of you who tuned in. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.